Hello and welcome to Cruising and Musing. In this episode, we are going to be coming to you from the desktop and talking about this article here that Dr. John over at Echelon Education Consulting covered early in his piece. And I was reading through this article while he was talking about it, and I felt he was being a little too generous to them. So we are going to read this article from the AP that says, Talk of Race, Sex in Schools Divides Americans, AP NORC poll. Guess that should say shows at the end, by Hannah Fingerhut and Annie M.A. And this came out just recently in April 14th of 2022. And this has a lot to do with the Parental Rights in Education Act that is in Florida. Now, I've read through this entire article, and I want to point out a couple things that let you know that this is going to be well, the article is very much biased. It provides us some numbers here, but that's not what's biased. To talk about the numbers is pretty straightforward. They do kind of couch it in language that tells you what they want you to think. But how to put this? Here's a good example. When we scroll down and we look at this paragraph here, the findings reflect a sharply politicized national debate that has consumed local school boards and increasingly state capitals. First off, this is an exaggeration. This is what the numbers show is that 40% of everyone agrees with each other that things are fine the way they are and nothing needs to be changed. And then that there's, from there a delineation of some think that too much is being taught and others think not enough. So they're already being like, hey, we got this sharp divide. It's like, no, 40% of everyone agrees with each other. That's not a really sharp divide. Republicans can see the fight over the school curriculum as a winning culture war issue that will motivate their voters in the midterm elections. There is a big red flag in your bias because they only talk about how Republicans see this fight. So the implication here is that the Republicans do not have genuine motivations. They don't care about the children. They don't care about education. They just see this as a way to win votes. That is what this wants your brain to process. If it was not a partisan bias being shown here, it would also make a comment like this about the Democrats and their political motivations, or this sentence would not be here at all. Moving on in this, we come on down. Now there's obviously some agreement here that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought attention to the stuff that's going on inside the schools and more interest in what's going on in schools. That was going to happen when send everyone home and everyone in the room can listen to what the teacher has to say. But we're going to scroll down past this non-controversial stuff of what they're talking about with virtual schooling and the pandemic fallout. A lot of it is common sense, and get down here to where they start getting more political again. And we start off down here with Kendra Schultz said that she and her husband have decided to homeschool their 1-year-old daughter because of pronouns being talked about in a pre-K class. And this one is kind of, this isn't apples to apples. The rest of this whole thing is talking about K through 12, and the only person they have speaking as a conservative, they're talking about, a 4-year-old pre-K class. That's not really within that realm of K-12. That's before K-12. And they simply say that, as a little kid, you should be learning your ABCs, numbers, basic things like such, not these extra pronouns. So, they're being disingenuous by not having, someone in the K-12 system talk about this, because that's how they're referencing everything else. Here you have another partisan lean. In Florida, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, so they're stressing to underline that it's Republican. in March signed into law a bill barring instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity in kindergarten through third grade. I'm very glad they point out that it's in kindergarten through third grade. Opponents, including the White House, have dubbed it the Don't Say Gay law. At no point here do they actually say what the actual name of the law is, which would be the Parental Rights and Education Act. And they don't at all address what it actually does. What the Parental Rights and Education Act does is it says that, hey, if a student comes to the school and expresses some sort of distress, they think they're gay, they're suicidal, any of that the school now has a duty to inform the parent. The old-fashioned idea from the 60s that, if little Timmy thinks he's gay, he's going to be ostracized and beat to death, is now a rarity in the United States. Yeah, there's religious extremists out there, but it's not common. And, the sheer threat of mental health issues, especially that have been on the rise for our children with the lockdowns and the pandemic and being out of school, really this bill is going to do a lot of good and help and intercede and get those kids the psychiatric help they need. So when you have a kid talking about hurting themselves or being super depressed, you want the teachers to be able to tell the parents about that. You don't want the teachers hiding that because, oh, mom and dad won't understand. No, school is a team between the parent, the child, and the teacher, sometimes the administration as well. You don't get to cut the parent out of their kid being depressed or assume they know. You need to make sure they know. That's for the wellness of the child and the child's safety. If, suddenly you have an 8-year-old, up until this point in history, if a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old came up to me and said, I'm gay, I'm gonna be like, what do you mean you're gay? You're 8. When you have no idea what you're talking about, has somebody done something to you to make you think like that? Because it's not normal for children that age to be engaged in sexuality and talking about sex. It's just not. It's usually a big red flag that there's been some kind of abuse or some kind of stress in that child's life. One of the major indicators of child sexual abuse is, quote unquote, from the textbook that I had to study to become a teacher, quote unquote, knowledge beyond their years. So, when you're talking about kids that have not yet hit puberty, they're not yet sexual creatures, walking around and declaring that they're gay or they're not gay, it's a red light. Just, it's an indication something is wrong. And it's not even, gay or not gay. It's, are they talking constantly about boobs? Do you have some little boy in there that's constantly talking about women inappropriately? Do you have a little girl in there that seems to know way too much about the male anatomy? It could, any sign of sexuality and sexual knowledge at that age is way too much. Kindergarten Cop was funny when the little kid pops up and says that he got kicked in the vagina, and Schwarzenegger goes, boys have penises, girls have vaginas, and then the kid parrots that later on. That's funny, that's comedy, but it's, not normal. You just don't see it in the classroom. So this law is meant to protect the children, keep the parents informed, so the parents can be aware of the mental health of their child. And again, mental health is in a crisis with school children after all the stress of the pandemic, distance learning, and being separated from their social norms for, going on 2 years now. It does point out that they're going in and ask about specific grade levels, just K-12. Moving down here, they move on to the next big glaring thing I want to talk about. In the Virginia governor's race last year, Republican, again, they're highlighted Republicans, as, taking these positions they want Democrats to have. Glenn Youngkin won after campaigning on boosting parental involvement in schools and banning critical race theory, an academic framework about systemic racism that has become a catch-all phrase for teaching about race in U.S. history. His Democratic opponent, Terry McAuliffe, had said in a debate that parents shouldn't tell schools what to teach. Critical race theory is not a catch-all phrase for teaching about race in U.S. history. That's what they want you to think is being said when people say they don't want to see critical race theory in schools. Critical race theory has been around since the late 80s, mid 90s, in the backwaters of academia as kind of an expansion past critical monetary theory or Marxism almost. And the idea is that, under critical monetary theory or Marxism, as it were, that, money begets power and everything is relative to the amount of money and wealth you have. Therefore, that's where the power is. So part of the idea of, overthrowing the bourgeois or bourgeois, the poor overthrowing the wealthy, is that by doing so, they're taking their power back and putting it into the hands of the many as a, rule by majority idea. Critical race theory replaces money and wealth with race instead. So by critical race theory, you have to have a position. You have power distributed based on a racial profile. And this is where you get ideas being expressed that you can't be racist unless you're white. You can only, so a black person running around shouting, "Kill all white people," isn't racist. Whereas some white knuckleheads putting up signs that say it's okay to be white, they're being racist because it's not okay to be white, according to the critical race theory. It's much deeper than just teaching about the, systematic racism that can be found when we look at American history. It's much deeper than teaching about race and the way it rolled in U.S. history. I myself teach U.S. history. They do a very good job of talking about, racism and the, African slavery in the U.S. They don't do a very good job talking about why the Native Americans were selected for slavery. The treatment of the rail workers and the Chinese was completely absent in the course. I had to interject that in myself. So, it's not everyone who's against critical race theory is against teaching the actual things that happened in race in U.S. history. What we're against is teaching race as an original sin, meaning that all the things that your ancestors did because of your race, or even not your ancestors, it's that same religious idea of original sin that comes out of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit of knowledge. It's, as soon as your ancestors committed their racial sins against the Africans by enslaving them, well, you carry that guilt forward throughout the rest of history. And, you can't wash your hands of it. In fact, I found various cartoons and things earlier that demonstrated that even someone like myself, according to these critical race theorists, where I say, look, my family came over, they were fleeing the unifications going on in Germany at the time. They got here in the 1880s, well after, slavery was done. They were never in the South. They were Pennsylvania hillbilly farmers. They were dirt poor potato farmers in Pennsylvania. They were German and then like Dutch on one side up there, crazy. And then the other side were Italians who didn't start moving in mass until the early 1900s and were very just heavily discriminated against at that time as well. So when I have my defense of, I can't be responsible for reparations or my ancestry was not responsible for slavery, they call that being having white privilege or expressing white privilege, and they mock it. Like, oh, just because he thinks he wasn't directly involved nor any of his ancestors directly involved, that they're any less guilty than their entirety of their race for the role of colonialism and what it played in around the world. That's the idea. That's the critical race theory, the idea of you need to feel guilt for the color of your skin and feel less for the color of your skin that they're standing against. It was wrong when it was done back in the 60s. There was a study they did where they brought out baby dolls to children, and they showed the young black girls baby dolls that were white and ones that were black skinned. And they said, told the girls to pick which dolls they wanted, and the girls were starting to pick the white dolls. And they asked them, "Why are you picking the white dolls?" And the heartbreaking thing is that the girls are expressing that the white dolls are the pretty ones, that the black dolls are the ugly ones. That sort of self-hatred and self-loathing based on the color of your skin, that's wrong. We shouldn't be teaching anyone to hate themselves based on the color of their skin. And what critical race theory does is it takes that kind of wrongness and just simply turns it around going the other direction. And there's that old adage that two wrongs don't make a right. There's no place for, teaching the young white children that they have to feel guilty about things that happened 150 years ago. It's not their fault any more than it's my fault, any more than it's your fault if you're listening to this. That's the critical race theory that nobody wants to see pushed in. The critical race theory no one wants to see pushed in are things like the 1619 Project that want to teach that, the United States' history didn't start with the founding of the United States, that it instead started with the first importation of African slaves and plantation life in the Americas. It's the writings of Ibram Kendi, where he, goes on about how you have to be it's not enough to not be racist, one must be anti-racist. It's the introduction and abuse of ideas such as, implicit bias, how, the implicit bias study is used to try to measure small differences in subconscious signaling that's going on in your brain. And now you have the perfect thought crime that you can accuse people of where everyone is racist. Even if they've never done a racist thing in their life, you can say, oh, well, your body's initial reaction is to tighten up a little bit when you see a black man's image on the screen in front of you, therefore you're racist. And what they found was that black people had the same kind of initial reaction of tightening up a little bit when they saw a white person's face on the screen, but they like to ignore that part of it when they're doing the critical race theory on this. And here's the thing, if everyone is unconsciously racist, and it doesn't matter that they don't show it and they don't act on those initial impulses that this implicit bias says are there, if it doesn't matter that they're not acting on these things and they're not acting on those thoughts, then that means everyone's guilty of unprovable thought crime. It's like the Salem witch trials. You can't prove you're not a racist. You can't prove you're not a witch. The only thing you can do is go up there and shout for more weight. So, or confess your sins and hope that they're merciful. This is not the way for this to do. This kind of witch hunt for racism in individual people is no different than the witch hunt we had for communism back in the MacArthur trials. It ain't good, it ain't right, and it has all the same things wrong with it in practice of theory that those things did. In fact, it's the same kind of garbage, just repackaged and given a new thing to try to get us to hate each other, and we shouldn't allow it to happen. That's the critical race theory that people don't want to see in. Ibram Kendi's work, Robin DiAngelo's work, the implicit bias abuse of that theory. I'm not even sure about the validity of some of the methods they used, and even the people who did the initial research on implicit bias have come out and denounced the way it's being used and the things it's being used to justify. And before you want to say that that's not present in the schools, I myself have had to sit through a teacher training in Florida where the trainer talked about implicit bias. And I've also had to sit through trainings where they wanted to talk about privilege. Moving on here from the critical race rant. We come down, expresses the idea that parents shouldn't tell schools what to teach. They don't. They don't. They elect the people who make the standards, who then bring it to the schools. It's kind of like the same way that they elect the people who make the laws, who bring it down to the police and decide what they, enforce. So yeah, kind of what you culturally want to be taught in schools is actually what parents say, and there's a process to follow. So that's on its face just kind of like I don't agree with that. If the public school is not to serve the parent, like the collective will of the parents and teach what they feel their children need to be prepared, then what's the point of having the public school? I'm like, even if you say it's the government's job to tell them, well, who's going to bring that government to be? And it's the parents, they're the ones voted. Most people have children. Moving on down here, they make it a point to say that they found somebody who's an independent, and she had this to say, that the truth should be taught whether it looks good or bad, all of the truth. And she makes fun here of Christopher Columbus and how he discovered America. But how can he discover something that's already there? I just feel like it's just not the whole history. Well, that's not how we teach it in school when we, teach the older children. When they're 7 or 8 and they're barely able to understand, the difference between a year, a decade, and a century, they can't really grasp those bigger abstract concepts, let alone the length of time and relative distances. That's not the real time to teach them deep, historical truths. Yes, there were already people in the Americas when Christopher Columbus discovered them. Why do we say that he discovered the Americas? Because the culture that, fed into ours and the culture he came from were unaware of the existence of the Americas before he traveled and brought word of them back to that culture. Therefore, he's recognized as the discoverer of those lands and those peoples. If we were to be in a Japanese classroom, we would probably be learning about early Japanese explorers who first, touched base in Thailand, Korea, mainland China, and the Philippines. And we would be talking about those explorers because they would be relevant to our cultural history and our national history. That shouldn't be too hard to, parse of, it's not about whether or not there were people there first. It's about it being new to that culture, which is our inherited culture from our European ancestors. Not all of us are European, but, that founding group that formed the country were mostly Englishmen up and down the East Coast, and then other waves of groups moved in. So why demonize or mock, this fellow just because you don't like what followed and try to take away from that? Christopher Columbus himself, I highly recommend you check out this channel, Knowing Better. He's a former history teacher that does very, very good videos. He does a wonderful bit on Christopher Columbus, discussing how Christopher Columbus was in many ways all the evil that we say that it said he is, but in many ways also not. Things like, he showed up and he declared that all of, these Native Americans would make great slaves. They were subservient and whatnot as a baseline. When you go back and you read the actual archaic Italian and you read the different ways it can be translated, a lot of it sounds like he's talking about they could be converted to Christianity very easily. Not so much enslaved, but made servants, servants of God, servant with a capital S, being servant of God. And that's nothing new. Even modern religions refer to, congregations and flocks as servants of God. The Jehovah's Witnesses refer to their council of leadership as the faithful slave. The Bible itself, declares, uses slavery in terms of talking that to people in relativeness to the religious beliefs. So you got to take that into the context that's going on here. that, a lot of the things written at this time do have this religious imagery that is used as they refer to things. Um, the plain, direct spoken English, like we have here in America, is kind of a new thing, and it's something America has really brought to the world and brought out. We've taken the poetry out of communication and replaced it with just straightforward efficiency. Um, Another thing he brings up about Christopher Columbus is Christopher Columbus. He went so far to try to prevent abuses of the native populations by the Spaniard immigrants that came in and settled and colonized, that he was cutting the hands off Spaniards. And that's what lost him his governorship, that he was being that harsh against the Spaniards for abusing people that they viewed as inferior to themselves. So, yeah, let's talk about the truth, all of the truth, the good and the bad, even for someone that everyone else wants to vilify, like Christopher Columbus. And, you guys can do your research, fact check this, check out that Known Better. I'm not going to list down a bunch of independent sources because he does a better presentation and is going to give you the same sources. So check out his channel. It goes down here that Wingard, president of the American Federation of Teachers, said parents and teachers are alike frustrated after pandemic disruptions and should partner to help kids recover. Efforts to predetermine curriculum and restrict teaching are getting in the way. What exactly is it getting in the way of when we pass laws that say, hey, you can't teach sex stuff K through 3? Like, we don't want you teaching straight sex. We don't want you teaching gay sex. We don't want to teach you teaching pan sex. We don't want you teaching tentacle sex. We don't want to teach you teaching hentai sex. We don't want you teaching anything. We want no talks of sexuality with children. It's just, what's that getting in the way of when we say we don't want you to talk about that? How much is it getting in the way of education when it says that, hey, we don't want you to teach this crazy critical race theory stuff? We want you to teach actual factual history, and by all means, teach the ugly part of it. Please don't be, don't go into hyper detail with our young children. 8-year-olds don't have to hear about slaves getting beaten with a cat of nines and it ripping away chunks of their flesh and permanently disfiguring them. But we can talk about that with the high schoolers if you really want us to. No problem. Usually if I'm talking about something, I'm going to try to keep it to a PG rating in a classroom. But if you want me to give high schoolers the rated R version of the violence in history and the grisliness of it, we can do that. It just doesn't seem necessary to get the point across. But, definitely with the young children, we don't want to do that. We don't want to traumatize them. We don't want to desensitize them, to horrible things. There's a reason even violent video games come with a graphics slider that lets you upper or lower the amount of blood you see and things like that. Because sometimes, what's cartoony violence on one end can be absolute graphic gore on the other and is inappropriate for kids. Continuing on here, as we go down, they quote a Democrat here who is the president of the Country Young Democrats, and again, they're talking. The only Republican they've quoted so far has a pre-K child that isn't even in school yet. Then they've quoted an independent that shares their viewpoints and talked about Christopher Columbus. And now they're quoting a Democrat who's not only a Democrat, but a leader of the Young Democrats at 31. And he says, I have to do a lot of studying and work to be able to make informed decisions. Good man. I love it when people research things before they make decisions. And I don't feel like parents generally have that kind of skill set for curriculum, he said. They take them for curriculum out of the quote, so he didn't say that skill set. So they're editorializing for curriculum. He didn't say for curriculum. I think professionals should mostly be determining what the curriculum should be. Henry worries that new restrictions are add an extra hassle for teachers who already have a lot on their plate to solve a problem that doesn't exist. actually these restrictions are taking things off of my plate. So I should already be reporting the student who is disturbed emotionally or is acting unusual or expressing things that should be concerning to me. I should be reporting that already. I just now report that to the parent as well and make sure they're included in the loop of things. I'm already teaching history and all the dark, nasty parts about history alongside the light sides of history. So we're going to be talking about all that. That's nothing new. The only thing you've taken off my plate is if I am a K-3 teacher and a kid, the kids are talking when they're doing group work, and one of the kids raises their hands and says, "Hey, Mr. So and so, what does pansexual mean, or what does demisexual mean?" And I say, "That's a very good question. You should go home and ask your parents that." I don't have a conversation about that right there with that child. That's something you can perfectly well tell them to go home and ask their parents. In fact, I have seen teachers doing a skit of them sending a student back and forth, them and the parents, with his uncomfortable questions. When he's asking what different words mean or he's using words wrong. Oh no, what does this word I was using wrong mean? Go ask your mom, and the mom sends them back to go ask the parent. It's one of those things. Somebody will eventually answer that child's question, or they'll look it up themselves. So, yeah, that's my take on this thing. This is a horribly slanted article that's trying to make it sound like something's going on that isn't going on. It's very disingenuous about what the right is objecting to, with what critical race theory actually is, what they're objecting to with what the Parental Rights and Education Bill actually says, and what the goal of that is for. And it's being very disingenuous just overall with the idea that it's trying to present itself as being a non-biased news source because it's on the AP, who we're supposed to be able to trust to stay neutral, when it's clearly couched in a whole bunch of partisan biased language. So yeah, this article is a bad article, and nobody should be reading this thinking they're getting the news. If you're reading this, you're not getting the news. If you're reading this, you're getting a curated editorial opinion piece, and it's bad, and you should find something else to research further in and reflect on, so you're not being fed this line of BS from these people. Thanks for hanging out this long. It's been about 35 minutes. I am Rob, host of Cruising and Musing. Subscribe, like, comment. When we get to 50, we can start having these things be interactive. Thank you so much.